Welcome to Riverside. This is the part of the Troutbitten project where I share some of the things I've been thinking about on the water and things I've been writing about for the website. Now, I just published an article called Learning to Lead. It's about leading while you're tightline nymphing. And I'm halfway through my fall guide season, and I'm reminded once again how often we need to focus on leading the flies. We're nymphing a lot, most of the hatches are done, streamer bite's good, but when we're nymphing and we're on a tight line, we need to learn to lead. Now, I grew up bait fishing, and leading for me, once I started nymphing on a fly rod, was just kind of intuitive. I understood how to do it because I already knew how to get some extra weight just moving through the currents, hopefully naturally. Now, that's the goal. Let me point this out too. Troutbitten reads more like a book than a blog. There's 1,500 articles, videos, and podcasts now, but nothing stands alone, and I point that out because this is kind of a technical article. The concepts in here are really based on so many of the other things that I've written before, that we've talked about in podcasts, not just based on, but supported by those things. I wrote this article, Learning to Lead, because of all the other things that have come before it. It's time to talk about really leading the flies. So I'll leave links to many articles and some podcasts, other resources up here. I'll also leave some in the show notes. And you really should go check out the article itself, because you can kind of break it down. Well, I can break it down a little bit better over there and leave clickable links that you can just kind of navigate around through the website and check things out. Now, one of the concepts that really needs to be broken down is the strike zone. When we're nymphing, you have the riverbed, and then let's say 6, 8, maybe 10, not 2 feet tall, maybe 6, 8, 10 inches tall is the strike zone. It's what I call the strike zone. It's a cushion of water that's going slower than everything else because it has to, because of the friction of the riverbed, because of the next rock that current bumps in, the next tree part. That's what slows it down. So that's the strike zone. Also, Austin and I on a podcast series last winter did critical nymphing concepts, and we said that there are 3 different ways to truly dead drift a nymph. We call it tracking, that's with lighter flies, strike zone rides, just gliding right through that zone I just talked about, and then bottom bouncing. And I think all of that stuff is really important supporting information, along with some other stuff that I'll link to really understand this article, Learning to Lead. Here we go. Leading nymphs through a great dead drift is a complex endeavor. It seems simple enough at first. Throw the fly upstream and recover the slack. But after some time and plenty of failure, every analytical, honest angler comes to the same conclusion. This isn't as easy as it looks. Drifting under an indicator is less complex than tightlining because there are fewer decisions to make. Once the fly and indicator are on the water, there's not much to do but keep tension off the indie and sense a strike. In essence, the indie makes the decisions about the progress of the fly down the current. But on a tight line, our rod tip is in charge of everything: the drop rate, the depth, and the speed. And dialing all of that in for each drift, every lane and every pocket, is complicated. And one more fact here must be acknowledged. With a nymph, we are simulating or imitating a dead drift more than actually achieving any natural progression through the current. Why? It's the weight. Even the lightest fly in our box falls directly to the bottom when unattached to a tippet. Even the smallest split shot sinks to the riverbed if we drop it out of hand before it's attached to the leader, and we've all done that. Weight falls, but real nymphs do not. They are neutrally buoyant, and they mostly glide through the currents. Thankfully, trout seem to be a little more forgiving about the perfect dead drift on a nymph. No doubt the 3-dimensional nature of currents, combined with the swimming and wriggling ability of nymphs, allows for a bit of randomness in the drift, and it still seems natural. Nymphs will never drift like dry flies, so we cannot approach the objective of a dead drift the same way. The dry fly weighs nothing. It sits in the top layer of the water, visible to us, and when we provide slack to the dry, it drifts naturally, unaltered by the tethered connection to us. But a nymph drift is very, very different. We need weight to get underneath. We need a straight line to the nymph if we are to have any chance at strike detection and a true natural ride in one lane. Weight falls, and a straight line pulls and influences the fly. These are the unavoidable consequences of a tight line system that we manage. Our efforts toward a dead-drifted nymph, then, are a balancing act, a compromise, with the falling weight and just the right tension from the rod. We need control and contact, enough to prevent the nymph from falling once it's in the strike zone, and we need to choose the right course for the fly, one lane, at just the right speed. Can you tell me again how tight line nymphing is really easy? It's not. Over the last 5 years or so, efforts have been advanced to actually make all of this a bit more attainable, or more accessible to more anglers. The current trend to go lighter, longer, and smaller, the thin to win mindset, has finally brought the ultralight concept to the nymphing game. Just as those principles have made their way to nearly every other fishing discipline. Fairly put, lighter weights means less work for the angler and more finesse to the flies. A lighter rig drops through the water column for longer, and when it does make it to the strike zone, it's much easier to keep the flies hovering downstream near the bottom in that strike zone without hanging up. Ultralight nymphing is what I call tracking the flies, and going extra light is an excellent way to get convincing dead drifts with nymphs. Indeed, tracking is much easier. Instead of making the decisions about drop rate, depth, and speed, tracking allows the river to make the decisions. That's the concept. But it's important to realize that our influence to the nymph is always there, simply because the tippet is attached, and because weight always follows. So what then of leading? I've written and done podcasts about leading versus tracking the flies, and while tracking produces trout on many days, I argue that good leading produces in more rivers, in more seasons, and under more conditions than tracking. Remember, everything works sometimes. Our ability, our skill for leading the nymphs through a good drift and aiming for perfection is what puts trout in the net more predictably than any other approach. But leading is tough. And as time goes on, I find that fewer tight-line anglers make the effort to learn to lead. Now, the opposite held true for many decades. Until recently, most proponents of nymphing emphasize the bottom-bouncing approach. This also catches trout, and it's the third way that I aim for dead drifts with nymphs. I break these tactics down this way: tracking, strike zone rides, and bottom bouncing. All are valid dead drifts. But to make the most of either strike zone rides or bottom bouncing, an angler must learn to lead. Touching the bottom is a good place to start. And if the riverbed is the goal, with bottom bouncing, then nothing beats a drop shot rig. And learning to lead either a shot or a weighted fly is fairly straightforward. Get the fly down and then keep it coming. But just like tight lining in general, the complexities add up. After years of guiding and watching some anglers lead flies almost intuitively, I've also seen far too many fishermen struggle with this fundamental skill. Leading shouldn't be that hard. So here are some keys for learning to lead. Eventually, strike zone rides are arguably more productive than pure bottom contact. But learning to lead starts best by touching the riverbed. Feel the bottom through the leader and the fly rod. Watch how the sighter responds and moves through the drift. See how the sighter softens in between the brief moments of bottom contact. This is excellent training for reading a drift and reading the sighter. While learning to lead, don't waste time with a long drop. Use enough weight in the fly or split shot to get the fly down in the first part of the drift. It shouldn't take half of the drift to achieve that first contact. I usually want to be in the preferred target zone within the first third of the drift or sooner. So for bottom bouncing, that means I'm getting that first bottom contact probably no longer than 2 seconds after the fly enters the water. So be willing to adjust weight and do it frequently. A fast run of 3 feet in depth requires maybe 3 times more weight than a soft run that's just calf deep. Use what is necessary to get down, and then lead through. Here's a side note: there are many other ways to get deeper, but weight is a critical component to the system. Don't fall into the trap of believing that lighter always means better. Before you adjust weight for a shallower piece of water, use the heavier weight that you already have on. Learn to hover that extra weight across the riverbed. Once you get it, this is a very convincing and useful look. I hear this way too often. People tell me, I don't want to drag things downstream unnaturally. And I agree, but I also don't want to watch the flies fall to the riverbed and just lay there. Once they're down, then we need to lead. Another way to think about all this is to simply prevent the flies from falling. Instead of worrying about how fast to lead the flies, just recover enough slack so the flies stop falling once they're down there. This is a good mental trick. Allow the flies to fall, then help them drift. If you stop the flies from falling anymore right at the riverbed, and the current can push the flies downstream, this is another way to think about what's actually happening down there. Always remember that without our influence, the weight falls. So it's up to us to lead through, even with the lightest flies. Be in control, be intentional, and make it happen. Keep the flies in one lane and choose a speed that matches the bottom current. Leading is much easier if we can see through the water and down to the riverbed. In this way, we notice a tall rock to go over or a pothole to dip into. So stop staring at the sighter and look to where the flies are, even if you can't see your flies or actually the riverbed. Look through the water and see where your flies are. Fishing bright orange, green, or white nymphs in clear water is an excellent tool for learning to lead. We surely want to strike when a trout eats the nymph, but when learning to lead, get stubborn about leading to the very end of the drift before setting and picking up for the next cast. These long drifts teach us to lead through the tough spots. Most anglers think about the speed first, and truly, good leading is precisely that, finding the natural speed of the current near the bottom of the river and keeping the nymph coming along. But instead of focusing on speed, think more about recovering slack, hovering over the bottom, and allowing the river to push the flies. Building those skills will lead you to the right speed with little effort. All the tips before this are about leading through a bottom-bouncing approach. However, most of them apply to leading through the strike zone as well. And nothing catches more trout than gliding the nymphs naturally through the first 4 to 10 inches off the riverbed, right in that strike zone. Once a bottom contact lead is refined, now move the target up a few inches and love your life. No single skill in the nymph game is more valuable than learning to lead. Good leading is a balance between the rod tip, the weight at the end of the line, and the river current. Good leading requires focus, experience, and some obsession about the details. Now, one more thing. Hanging up on the bottom once in a while isn't a mistake. It's just part of the process. Every day. Fish hard, friends. Have fun out there.